Welcome back. Our previous lesson was on how shifts in the demand and the supply curve affect equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Today we'll be looking at a simultaneous change in the demand and supply curves. We know from our previous lessons that the point of equilibrium is the point where supply and demand curves intersect. From this graph, this point is represented by point A. At this point, demand is equal to supply. This corresponds to an equilibrium price P star and equilibrium quantity Q star. Now previously, we looked at how the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity changes when demand and supply curve change separately. That is, when demand curve changes without a change in the supply curve, or the supply curve changes without a change in the demand curves. Now let's look at what will happen to equilibrium price or quantity when both curves change at the same time. That is, when both curves shift to the right, or both curves shift to the left, or there's a decrease in one and an increase in the other. Before we draw the curves, let's delve into the dynamics to see how the change in demand or supply is going to affect price and quantity. So in this example, we'll focus on a decrease in both demand and supply. The same understanding can be applied to when there's an increase in both demand and supply, or when there's an increase in one and a decrease in the other. So first, let's assume that only demand decreases without any corresponding shift in supply. So if only the demand curve shifts to the left, this is going to cause prices to reduce. This is because when demand curve shifts to the left without a corresponding shift in the supply curve, it's going to cause surpluses in the market. There will be more goods in the market than consumers are willing and able to buy. So for producers to be able to clear the market, they would have to reduce the prices of those goods for people to buy. So this will cause a reduction in price and consequently lead to a reduction in quantity. Now, if we look at the flip side and assume that only supply decreases, or only supply curve shifts to the left without a corresponding shift in the demand curve, this is going to cause an increase in price, because a decrease in supply without any decrease in demand is going to cause shortages in the market. People are going to be willing and able to buy more than producers are willing to sell. So for people to access the goods, they'll have to be willing to pay more for the good. Producers will also charge higher prices for those goods because they are scarce. So this is also consequently going to lead to a reduction in quantity. Now we can see that in both cases, quantity reduces, but that the price decreases when only demand decreases, but the price increases when only supply decreases. This means that when both demand and supply decreases, we are sure that quantity is going to reduce, equilibrium quantity is going to reduce, but the effect on price is ambiguous. It can increase or decrease or even remain the same depending on which shift is bigger. Now let's look at the curve to help us understand this properly. First, let's assume a big decrease in demand with a small decrease in supply. So we start from a demand curve here, which is our old demand curve. And if any factor in the market changes that reduces the demand of the good, it shifts us to a new demand curve. Now, the same for supply. We start on our old supply curve, and if any factor in the market changes that reduces the supply of the good, it shifts us to a new supply curve. We start from equilibrium point A and move to equilibrium point B. Now what we see here is that the shift in demand is bigger than the shift in supply. Demand shifts from this curve to that curve, but supply only shifts by a smaller margin as compared to the shift in demand. Now moving from equilibrium point A to equilibrium point B, we see that quantity has reduced. So equilibrium quantity will reduce. But moving from point A to point B, we also see that prices has reduced. So when the shift in demand or when the decrease in demand is bigger than the decrease in supply, equilibrium quantity will reduce and equilibrium price will also reduce. Now let's look at the instance where there's a small shift in the demand curve and a big decrease in the supply curve. If we start from an old supply curve and there's a decrease in supply which moves us to a new supply curve, and similarly we start from an old demand curve and there's a decrease in demand which moves us to a new demand curve. This movement also corresponds a movement from equilibrium point A to equilibrium point B. In this case, we see that the decrease in supply is much larger than the decrease in demand. This effect results in a decrease in quantity demanded, but also the movements from point A to point B result in an increase in price. So as compared to our previous example, you see that when the decrease in demand is smaller than the decrease in supply, quantity reduces but equilibrium price or increases. Now let's look at the last example, which is supply and demand both shift by a similar margin. If we start from an old supply curve and there's a decrease in supply moving us to a new curve, and similarly we start from an old demand curve and there's a decrease in demand that moves us to a new demand curve, we see that corresponds to a movement from point A to point B. This movement implies a reduction in equilibrium quantity from 4 to 1, but prices has not changed. This is because the margin of decrease is the same for both supply and demand. So what we have here is that prices can increase, decrease, or remain the same when there's an decrease in both demand and supply. Whether it increases or decreases or remains the same depends on the margin of shift. If the demand curve decreases more than the supply curve, then prices are going to reduce and quantity is also going to reduce. But if the supply curve shifts more than the demand curve, then quantity will reduce but prices will increase. But if both curves shift by a similar margin, then quantity will reduce but prices will remain the same. So we can use our previous dynamics to understand what we mean here. If the shift in demand, which is the decrease in demand, is greater than the decrease in supply, then it means that this effect here will outweigh the effect here. So the net effect is going to be a reduction in price. But if the decrease in supply is bigger than the decrease in demand, then the effect from the supply channel is going to outweigh the effect from the demand channel. And the net effect is going to be an increase in price and a reduction in quantity. This same analogy can be used to understand the flip case, where there is an increase in both demand and supply, or a decrease in one and an increase in the other. In this example, we looked at just a decrease in demand and supply, and we found that in both cases, quantity is going to reduce, but the effect on price is going to depend depend on which shift is bigger. This is all for our lesson on simultaneous change in demand and supply curve. Our next lesson will be on price elasticity of demand. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.